Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth edition of the Climate Justice Charter Movement webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about the just transition, South Africa's viable alternative. This is the fourth in a series where we're unpacking the Climate Justice Charter, what it means for grassroots communities, and what it means for the country. We've already had 3 sessions talking about a variety of issues, and we have 2 more webinars scheduled for the completion of this series. Today, I'm going to be joined by Kaamil Alli, a political activist, former WITS SRC Secretary General, and former Medical Students Association, MSA, Union President. And we'll be unpacking and talking about the just transition, which is a concept that enables a viable, sustainable future for South Africa's energy industry and for South Africa's workers, and for the future of South Africa in general. The International Trade Union Confederation defines a just transition as a just transition secures the future and livelihoods of workers and their communities in the transition to a low carbon economy. It is based on social dialogue between workers and their unions, employers, government, and communities. A plan for just transition provides and guarantees better and decent jobs, social protection, more training opportunities, and greater job security for all workers affected by global warming and climate change. Transition is pushed to when we launch this Justice Charter movement. It's a grassroots movement concerned with social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice, and intergenerational justice. We want you to also support this document. You can sign a petition that we've created as an individual or endorse the charter as an organization. There's some links that have been sent to the Zoom chat, which you can just click on in order for you to sign the petition and to support the Climate Justice Charter movement. You can also find us online, just search for Climate Justice Charter Movement. We're on Twitter, and you can also find on YouTube videos by the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, COPAC SA. Also on Facebook, you can follow COPAC SA. You'll find a variety of information about the Climate Justice Charter movement. But for today, let's transition in a just manner. Let's transition in a grassroots manner. Thank you for joining us this evening, Kaamil.
Good evening, Tshiamo, and thanks again for hosting me. I really do appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share this platform.
So what I want to find out from you, Kaamil, just to start us off, why does South Africa have such a large carbon footprint?
So, I think this question, like with everything else in our country, has a context with an apartheid backdrop to it, right? During the apartheid era, South Africa began this process of becoming very heavily reliant on coal. We saw companies like Sasol being established as well, and Sasol's main business model is to use coal for the production of fuel. And South Africa is quite unique because post-apartheid there hasn't been much of a shift in that model of using coal to power our country, essentially. Currently, South Africa ranks 13th in the world for carbon emissions. And along with Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico, we're one of 4 developing countries that are contributing to massive carbon emissions to the global total. And this is quite out of the ordinary because ordinarily it would be developed countries that are contributing quite a large amount of carbon to the global total. The rest of the countries in the top 20 are all developed nations. So South Africa produces almost 70% of our power from coal sources and only 11% from renewable energy sources. So this is the fundamental problem. And this is the reason why South Africa has such a huge carbon footprint and why we contribute in such a big way to the global total.
Kaamil, is it also the case that South Africans use a lot of energy overall?
Not necessarily. South Africans use, and I think this question is quite important in context, right? Because poorer South Africans tend to use less energy than wealthier South Africans. And there's more poor people in South Africa than there are wealthy people. So on average, South Africans don't really use that much energy when you compare to global totals and to global averages as well. So yeah, I think I think perhaps if what you're asking is if we could use less, I think that the answer is definitely yes. We can definitely do better, but I don't think that we're amongst the worst when it comes to energy consumption.
Well, certainly wealthier South Africans, but I understand what you're saying. Coal seems to be the big enemy here, and that's why I suppose we are talking about a just transition. So can you break it down for the people joining us this evening? What exactly is a just transition? How will it affect our energy use and the various aspects of our economy and environment?
Yeah, so I think you gave quite an apt definition in your introduction from the International Trade Union Confederation, but I found another definition which I think sums up quite nicely what we mean and what the Climate Justice Charter seeks to achieve when it speaks about a just transition. And it's from the Climate Justice Alliance. And their definition is that a just transition is a vision-led, unifying and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. This means approaching production and consumption cycles holistically and waste-free. The transition itself must be just and equitable, redressing past harms and creating new relationships of power for the future through reparations. If the process of transition is not just, the outcome will never be. So essentially what this definition is seeking to address is a number of issues, right? So we're speaking about a set of principles, right? So these sort of non-negotiables that need to be in place in order for us to move from a so-called extractive economy to a regenerative economy. So instead of just taking and pulling from the earth and burning the entire time, we look at more renewable ways of doing things, things that don't have so much waste in its production process. We speak about this definition, rather speaks about economic and political power shifting, right? So at the moment, South Africa is one of the most, if not the most unequal countries in the world. And all the economic and political powers sit with an elite group. And that is fundamentally problematic because it means that those who are most affected by the climate crisis are the ones who have the least say in how these things tend to, or how things should change. So part of a just transition is making and putting that economic and political power back into the hands of those who are seen to be at the bottom of the social structure. And then the definition goes on to say that that if the process is not just, the outcome will never be. So again, reinforcing this idea that throughout this process, throughout us moving towards a better future, everyone who is most affected must be involved. And we can't leave people out, we can't leave communities out, we can't leave activists out. Everyone needs to have a say, and those, in fact, at a community level need to have the most say because they're the ones who are affected by the transition the most.
Yes, Kaamil. I mean, you're mentioning inequality, South Africa being one of the most unequal countries in the world. And, jumping on that, you also mentioned in that definition the word reparations. I was wondering if you could also unpack that a bit. What role does reparations play in redistributing resources and creating that equality, but also in the just transition process itself?
Yeah, so I think, I wanted to speak about this a bit later on, but at its very core, the just transition is anti-capitalist, right? And what it seeks to do is seek to do things in a manner that hasn't been done before. I think South Africa is quite a, I don't know. I think we may encounter problems if we use the word reparations in anything that we do because of the manner in which our restorative justice process took place during the 90s. And, reparations was never something that was discussed. But what I understand from the term reparations here is these corporations and these capitalist institutions, which have contributed to the climate crisis. These are the organizations and institutions and systems that need to then be accountable, be held accountable, and need to then come forth with reparations to assist the process in us transitioning to a more just and equitable future.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So that might also include things like carbon taxes, making sure that the people who are wealthy pay their fair share of the economic harm and environmental damage they've already done. Are those some of the things that we can push within a just transition?
100%, and those are some of the things that are absolutely necessary. A wealth tax and a carbon tax are some of the things that are essential in financing the just transition, because we know that communities are not necessarily going to have the financial resources and capacity to do it, but we know that those corporations who are guilty of sort of climate crimes do have that capacity, and they are the ones who are to blame for us being in the situation that we're in at the moment, government included. And those are the people that need to come to the party. And so wealth tax and carbon taxes are definitely 100% have to be included.
And I suppose that's the next thing I want to ask you about. Can you explain how it's possible that South Africa can become coal-free? There may be people who believe that coal is still necessary to power some of our energy demands. So you're mentioning that there is existing financial capacity. And another question is, what happens to all the coal workers?
Yeah, so it's a complex matrix within which we have to work as South Africans, because, I mean, just to start with the latter point, right, about workers, South Africa employs about 92,000 people in the coal industry. And that's a huge number. If you look at internationally, gradually countries have decreased the size of the coal mining industry and the coal industry, and so their workforce isn't necessarily as big. But because of South Africa's reliance on coal, we still have a huge number of workers within the sector. So in terms of South Africa becoming coal-free, I think it would be, in my most humble opinion, ambitious for us to say that South Africa would become completely coal-free. I think that we should look to become carbon neutral, and if that means that there is still some reliance on coal, then it may have to be a small price that we pay. But I think that the whole point of a transition is that it's going to take time, right? If you look at some examples, and I know that I'm supposed to speak about this a bit later on, Tshiamo, so I'm sorry if I'm grabbing your questions from you. But if you look at some examples like Spain, they actually had a model in which they transitioned in a gradual basis, right? But it was still a lot faster than what South Africa, what's possible, I think, in South Africa. So it's also because of the resources that were available to them at the time. So Spain invested around 250 million euros in decarbonization, and specifically for workers within the coal industry. But they only had, at the time, I think it was 2018, only 1,700 workers in the coal industry, and we have 90,000, right? So it's going to take a lot more than that for us to invest in order for us to transition the way they did. But again, we don't have to copy and paste things from other countries. We are a unique country and we have unique context and needs. And so we need to develop ideas and systems and frameworks that works for us. Another example is in Germany. There's a particular, there's a particular region in Germany called Ruhr, and they invested 17 billion euros And most of that money was driven towards early retirements for workers in the industry, and for then reskilling of younger workers to capacitate them to be able to move into new industries. So I think what's common here is that in order for us to become coal-free, and in order for us to not lose anyone along the way, we require huge investments. And I think it's really important for us to prioritize this, because without this move towards a sustainable future, we're looking at dire circumstances. I mean, I think that we've had enough examples in South Africa over the past few years, especially, about what a future without a sustainable and stable climate looks like. You know, we just take the water crisis in the Western Cape, for example, and the ongoing water crisis in the Eastern Cape as well. It's unbelievable that we could have thought that we'd be in a situation like that, but it's a reality, right? And climate change affects absolutely every facet of the country. You know, you're not safe anyway, so it's not like you can just up and move and not be affected by climate change.
I suppose what you're saying then is the only barrier toward a just transition in our context is whether or not it will be financed. And we spoke about a bit earlier about the kind of methods that we can finance. What do you think can happen in South Africa to generate the political will to start changing decisions that are made toward investing more of that financing into, creating the investment infrastructure, the examples we spoke about earlier about how they transition? What kind of changes would we need to see?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, South Africa has a very rich history in struggle, right? And this is, I think, for me, one of the most important struggles of our time as a young generation. And the only way, unfortunately, it seems as though our government responds to things is if there's a big enough noise around it and there's enough disruption. So I do think that in addition to young people being active within the policy space, because I think that we mustn't neglect that, and I think that there's a huge number of young people in that space, you know, trying to advocate for policy change and that kind of thing. I know young people in Coalfree, especially, are pushing hard for those kind of things. We need a movement that's going to be mass-based. And the way I see it, the Climate Justice Charter is our best option. We need to rally South Africans around this idea. And I think that process has already begun, and it's far along as well, and that's why we're here today. But we really do need to push government hard on a mass scale. And I think that unfortunately COVID-19 has sort of stopped us in our tracks. I think that we would have done a lot more in terms of mobilizing South Africans towards the Climate Justice Charter had it not been for the pandemic. But I think that there's still room, you know, for us to move and to maneuver and try to force the hand of government. You know, there's a number of ways, you know, there's a number of arms of government that we can use to try and force this political shift. You know, the parliamentary process is an essential process, but there's also the judiciary and the executive, which are places that I think we could focus on, you know. Unfortunately, the courts have become a battleground in South Africa of late, political battleground. And I think that we need to use the courts again for good. We need to use the courts to advocate for things that the Constitution envisages, you know. The right to a healthy and safe environment is fundamental in the Constitution, and it's something that we need to advocate for. And if it means that we must try to lobby finances around the idea of a court case, advocating for the state to legislate climate policy that's going to be more sustainable for our future as young people and for generations after us as well, then that's what we should do as well.
So I suppose, Kaamil, the lobbying process is indeed very important. So you wrote an article in the Daily Maverick speaking about a just transition, and a lot of your focus point was on grassroots organizing. So I suppose we've spoken a lot about the top-down kind of things. How do we finance this? how do we get government to change their minds, but what's the role of grassroots communities? So what does a grassroots transition look like?
And I think, yes, so thanks, Tshiamo. I think the climate justice charter is, if everyone on the call has read through it already, will have ample knowledge about how grassroots level initiatives tend to work, right? Because the climate justice charter focuses on this quite heavily. But essentially, a grassroots transition is focusing on communities and not on profit. It's focusing on us being enough for ourselves and for the environment as well. So I'm just going to pick out a few points from the Climate Justice Charter that I thought were quite salient in this regard. So the first is that there must be socially owned and community-based renewable energy through a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. Again, we spoke about this before, that our dependence on coal and oil and gas and nuclear energy and all of these other kinds of unsustainable, dangerous powering fuels is not going to provide us with any kind of sustainable future. So we definitely need to look at ways of communities being invested in, you know. So I think that one of the critical ways of doing this is for municipalities to relook at bylaws, so that we can have people who wish to produce their own energy being able to do so without the kind of taxes that we're seeing at the moment and the proposed taxes that we're seeing at the moment. But also for these big corporations, and it's mentioned here, Eskom and Sasol in particular, to really plow back into the community, right? And for those communities to own whatever it is, be it solar farms, wind farms, whatever the case may be, the community must own them and must decide what happens with whatever it is that comes from there. The next point is to feed ourselves through food sovereignty. So one of the greatest challenges that the climate crisis poses to us is food insecurity. In South Africa, we know the kind of statistics that exist around food security and how vulnerable we are as a society. So what we need is to prioritize these small-scale farmers and agricultural needs that just about meets the needs of our people, right? Because industrial food production, I mean, there's so much waste that goes into industrial food, in the industrial food process, right? The amount of water that goes to waste in the production in the industrial food process it's alarming. And you know, South Africa is a water scarce country as well. So we need to focus and control the very thing that sustains us, which is food. The next point is to democratize the water commons. I think it was during the water crisis in the Western Cape when I came to learn that some water in the Western Cape is actually owned privately, and I was so shocked and surprised and taken aback by that, because I had no idea that you are allowed to own such large volumes of water as individuals. My understanding, according to South African law, is that the state controls all its water resources. But things like this need to change, right? If it means that private people and private entities are in control of that water, of those water resources, that needs to change. And also we need to really look at protecting our water resources a lot more. I mean, we're seeing just in Gauteng at the moment, the issues that we're having with the Vaal River system and the amount of pollution that's taking place in and around that area. And it's just a lack of commitment to protecting our water resources. And that's such a huge problem because, like I said earlier, South Africa is a water scarce country. And the last point that I took from the Climate Justice Charter was eco-mobility and a clean public transport system. I think that, you know, our cars at the moment, we have just way too many cars on our roads in South Africa, especially in our urban cities. We don't have efficient public transport systems. Our railways are completely decimated, and that again means that people need to use other means of transport to get to their places of work and such. Means that there's more taxis on the roads, which means that there's more carbon emissions at the end of the day, right? So what we need is an efficient public transport that is sourced from clean energy. There are many examples around the world of this. I was in Norway in 2019, and their entire bus system is electrified. So they have only electric buses, and all of the buses run on renewable energy, electricity sourced from renewable energy. And I think just generally there are way too many cars on our roads, and with the dawn of the fourth industrial revolution, there's so many other ways of moving around and reducing your carbon footprint as an individual, but also the state that needs to provide better transport services for our people. So these are just some of the points that I thought I would use to illustrate what a grassroots transition looks like, right? There's obviously a much more comprehensive list of initiatives from within the Climate Justice Charter, but I just thought that those are a few points that I take from there and speak a bit on.
It sounds like these are a lot of municipal ideas. Community-owned renewable energy at a municipal level, making sure that water is not owned by private corporations, but maybe by people, maybe municipalities, transport systems, which municipalities can also invest in. So it sounds like a grassroots sort of transition would look at lobbying municipalities, also changing things within the municipality that we're within. Or what do you think about this, municipal-based transitioning?
I think, look, in an ideal situation, I would 100% lobby for that to be the norm. I think I've spoken about it a bit, but I think that unfortunately we've lost a lot of trust between the people and the state. The social contract is very weak at the moment. So it would require municipalities to regain that trust of people, to if they are unable to deliver basic services as it is, I don't think that we can trust them at the moment to deliver this kind of massive shift in our paradigm and in our systems. But in the same token, we need to force them to. We need to mobilize so that people are not burdened with having to shoulder this transition. It needs to be the state, and it needs to be those institutions that have contributed to the crisis that we're in at the moment, because it's simply unfair to require people to shoulder the burden.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to talk to you a bit more about some of the examples that you've mentioned. You've mentioned quite a few. First, if you're attending the webinar and you have any question, you can just post a comment on the chat, and I'll ask Kaamil, and we'll have a short discussion about that. So, Kaamil, what can we learn about just transitions in other parts of the world? What lessons have we picked up on? What's helpful for South Africa?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned the two earlier from Spain and Germany, but I think there's a number of other places to learn from, especially within. I think at the moment Europe is moving quite fast rather with their transitions, and it is coming from a sort of central legislative place within the European Union, and they are legislating these countries into complying with certain regulations on becoming more sustainable and more climate resilient. But again, Europe is not necessarily the best example because their context is very different. So I think that we can take from those places, we can take from those countries Where they've done well, we can learn. But I think that what we need to do as South Africa is to acknowledge that there is an alternative, right? And then from there, build our own unique example of what a just transition looks like, and be an example perhaps to the rest of Africa, because I think that while we do sit slightly towards the top of the table in Africa, our context is not too dissimilar from the rest of Africa. So I think that what we need to do is play a leading role on the continent as South Africa when it comes to a just transition and building a climate resilient nation. But yeah, I think that the lessons that we can take are there, and yeah, we need only look and take from where we can.
And what are some of the barriers, from us learning this lesson? So we've seen other countries, you mentioned a lot of these in the European context, although, but, moving toward cleaner energy, moving toward, you talked about carbon neutrality, various kind of concepts. What are some of the barriers of our country moving in that same direction?
Well, I think I wouldn't have the complete answer to that, but I do have an idea just from the bit of research that I have been doing. And I mean, ultimately, it boils down to who controls the energy sources and the resources in the country, right? Because those are the institutions and individuals and firms that are going to dictate policy a lot of the time, because they have the bargaining and the lobbying power, and unfortunately, government is then playing a more subservient role to these firms and corporations. Some of them multinational corporations, even not just South Africans, and that's probably the biggest barrier to us moving forward. But at the same time, I mean, one can't always look outward and blame other people. Our government and our state needs to take responsibility for it. And I think, like with a number of issues that we're faced with in our country, we have a legislative that's unfortunately like a huge sleeping beast, right? There's just nothing happening in Parliament, like where are the conversations around this kind of thing in our legislatures, not only at a national level, but at a local level and a provincial level as well. I think that that's also a huge barrier. There's no political will, or very little political will, to move us to a more sustainable future. And it's unfortunately because many politicians benefit from the current system. And I think that once we're able to hold our leaders accountable, we can have conversations again about different barriers, perhaps that are smaller. But I think those are the biggest ones at the moment.
I want to steer us on that basis. You're talking about holding our leaders accountable, looking inward, the state taking responsibility. I also saw in your article, you mentioned that there's attempts to do those things in the past, but that's the old way of trying to transition, that we now need a way of transitioning, which is grassroots, which is worker controlled. How do we build up that large worker movement, grassroots movement in the country that will enable us to rely on ourselves, to look inward, and not so much on government or state? So how do we get to the point where a grassroots transition is even possible?
Yeah, and I think that this is why the process of the Climate Justice Charter is important, because I think the moment people are aware of what the Climate Justice Charter is and what it seeks to do, and the moment they're aware of the problem, I think that we'll start to see a lot more growth within the climate movement, or the climate justice movement in South Africa. I think it's going to take a lot of hard work for climate justice activists to mobilize in this fashion. When I was on the SR, just before my SRC term, we had the Fees Must Fall movement within institutions of higher learning. And that was a mass-based movement that was focused on institutions of higher learning. But I think that the sporadic nature of Fees Must Fall isn't something that's going to be replicated particularly easily with something like the Climate Justice Charter and climate justice in general. I think that it's going to take a lot more perseverance, and it's going to take a lot more educating the general populace around the problems that we're facing. But I also don't think that it's going to take too much work. I think that what it needs is just a kind of awareness, because I think that people on the ground understand their problems and they know where their problems come from. So speaking about food security and food insecurity, people who are in those situations know who the culprits of those particular injustices are. People who are suffering in drought-stricken areas, they're at the coalface of it, so they understand their problems. What we need is to mobilize those communities towards our cause, right, as the Climate Justice Charter. And I think that in doing so, we'll build a movement that can't be ignored.
And I imagine that this means that this message resonates with people, that when you go out and you speak about a just transition, there's a lot of people who want to come on board and join in mass mobilization for this kind of initiative.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I spend quite a bit of time on Twitter, and I think that the response to the climate crisis, rather, just on Twitter. And Twitter is by no means a yardstick. I'm just speaking generally, because I think that social media is the new place of activism in many ways. But I think that people's response to the climate crisis, particularly on social media, has been huge. So if you can replicate those kind of things, people definitely respond on the ground to those people who are not necessarily very active on social media. But social media is an important instrument, because what social media does is it attracts mainstream media, and then mainstream media then is watched by millions of people around the country, momentum and to get people speaking around this topic.
So I suppose the final thing I want to ask you, we haven't received any questions yet from the public, but if you are attending the webinar and you do have a question, now is the perfect opportunity to just pop one in the chat. I suppose the final question I want to find out from you is, what happens now? So where do we go to from now? We're interested in this just transition. What's the next step? What step should we take right now? So where are we right now on the journey?
So there's a number of things that are happening. I think that the Climate Justice Charter being, I think, the main one. But there's all sorts of international pressures as well that South Africa is facing. We are a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which seems to be the foremost international consensus on where we should be moving in terms of becoming carbon neutral. But the Paris Agreement is by no means the be-all and end-all. In fact, it's quite insufficient if we to address the immediacy of the climate crisis. But it is something that we are signatory to, and something that government has to adhere to. So, I mean, we're seeing the kind of changes within government policy, moving to a renewable, a more diverse energy mix. This is the terms that the state is using at the moment. So the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, again, not necessarily something that we need to buy into as the Climate Justice Charter, but it is happening. So I think that, there's a number of these things happening, not only in the country, but around the world as well. And we're in a moment, I think, where we need to push quite hard. I think if we can take this conversation to perhaps an institutional level, I think coming from a university, I've seen the effectiveness that institutions of higher learning play. You know, I think that they are critical in determining the discourse and the way our country moves. So I think that institutions need to be more vocal and try to adopt these ideas and principles around a just transition. And then I think that people who are involved and people who have been involved in these webinars and you know, who have been exposed to the climate justice charter need to start promoting the ideals of a just transition within their communities. I think that you know, people like myself who have platforms elsewhere need to do more in terms of spreading the message and spreading the word. And then once I think we've given it some time to spread, I think we need to come back to around the table and speak about a proper strategy to get government to listen and to force them. I think that the petition is doing quite well. I haven't checked it recently, but the last time I did, we seem to be headed in the direction that we want to be. And once Parliament is you know, forced to give us an ear, I think that we need to come down hard and make sure that they listen to the demands that we have. But I think that it's important for us to start mobilizing within our communities to build that grassroots approach. And it's really important as well to build international networks, you know, to learn from other countries, their lessons, you know, but not necessarily the governments of other countries, but rather people in other countries, you know, climate activists in other countries. What are they doing, you know, to try and advocate for this change? And in building international solidarity and international networks and consensus, we won't be left behind, and we can also assist others in trying to build just transitions within other jurisdictions as well.
Sounds like
sure, I think that was a mouthful.
It's good. You've given us a good roadmap. It sounds like what you're saying is we're at the information stage right now, disseminating information, gathering support through petitions. And I think we just keep on going down that road, eventually building toward that just transition. And like you said earlier, it is a process. We have a question from Mashudu. It's quite a layered question. They're asking, I'm keen to know your thoughts on how South Africa can respond to the industry trends of ticking the just transition box. So they've given this example of multinationals demerging from thermal coal, labeling it as moving towards sustainable operations. But in practice, this demerger refers to transfer of mining rights to small or mid-tier mining companies. The example they've given is the recent Anglo-American demerger in coal in South African business units by transfer of rights and financing of Tugela resources. So basically, you know, this demerging, which is packaged like it's moving away from coal, which is ticking the box, but isn't actually doing anything. Shouldn't the lobbying be focused on international standing setting bodies and global financiers, they're asking, particularly in the South African context where we know there's political will and corruption will be significant barriers. So I guess this person's asking, what do we do about large corporations and the ways in which they protect transition but don't?
Yeah, I think sure it is quite layered. I'm going to try my best to answer it as best as I can, but I think that what we need to it's difficult. It's difficult because without any kind of legislative backing, communities and individuals have very little. Well, individuals at least. I think that communities, we may have more. We do have more power than what we let on a lot of the time. But as individuals, if you were to go in and say, well, this demerger is actually just it's just on paper ticking a box. There's a box ticking exercise. You wouldn't get anywhere because that is currently what the policy says, right? It's like if corporation A complies with A, B, and C, then it's fine. You know, we can move on and all be happy about it. But I think that if affected communities are unhappy about the way in which things are done, and they stand up and take a stand against it, I think that we'll have a better outcome. I think that if we look at the example of Xolobeni, where the community there said no and continues to say no, the state and these multinational corporations won't have a choice but to listen to the communities. And I think that that's the kind of mobilization and activation that we need from the ground, so that we avoid this kind of things. And then once we have the attention of the state, we can force policy changes that are more in line with what we want to see, and not just a box ticking exercise.
It sounds like what you're saying is, if we leave this just transition in the hands of industries and corporations, it's not going to happen. But if we rise up as people on the ground, as communities, then it will actually occur. Kaamil, I suppose, thank you so much for unpacking the just transition, for speaking about grassroots politics, for giving us a clear roadmap. I think for many people watching this webinar, don't forget to find the petition. The link's been sent in the chat, to read and share the climate justice charter, to follow our activities online. As Kaamil mentioned, right now, the phase that we're in this transition within South Africa is an information phase, where we need to gather support for the charter, more information about what the transition is and what it means, and hopefully this webinar helps to unpack that as well. To everyone who's watching, in the next 2 weeks, we'll be having the 5th edition of the Climate Justice Charter Movement webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Kaamil.
Thank you so much, Tshiamo, and thanks Awande and Jane as well for the invitation. You guys have been awesome. And really, I look forward to any further such engagements around this issue. It's something that I'm quite passionate about, and hopefully we'll start to see some change within the near future.
Yeah, we share your passion, Kaamil. I'd also like to thank everyone that came to the webinar this evening. Thank you for spending your time, for talking about the Climate Justice Charter, for taking this issue quite seriously. It's something that is literally holding the future in our hands, because the Climate Justice Charter is about social justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and intergenerational justice for all of us. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.